The question that I've been asked to talk about is reconciling mass mobility and livable cities. And this is a particularly important question for London, because London was the first city in the world to actually have to try to answer this question. London is the original megacity. If you go back to Victorian times, the 19th century, London was the biggest city in the world. 6.5 million people. With its hinterland, nearly 10 million people. The only megacity that at the time existed. And it was overcrowded and dirty and suffering enormous constraining mobility challenges that forced people into unsanitary living conditions and reduced life expectancy to less than half of the life expectancy that we enjoy today. So these were existential issues to solve. And the first great revolution that occurred was, of course, the creation of the London Underground, the world's first mass transit railway, which opened in 1863 and celebrated its 160th anniversary last year. And from that, the London Underground was formed. By the start of the 20th century, London had an electric tram network, about 3,000 electric trams, the largest in the world, carrying 1 billion people every year, plus a growing network of electric underground railways. And I think this picture illustrates for me the way this challenge of mass mobility and livability was solved. This is a picture for a poster for Golders Green Station, which is now a suburb in North London, but opened in 1907, and it was greenfields. There was nothing there. And my grandmother saw it in those days. She was born in 1901. And you can see that woman there living a life of the purest livability in her beautiful garden, surrounded by flowers and greenery. And if you imagine what she was used to in the city that existed, that was revolutionary. But what made it possible, look in the back of the picture there, is the electric train that could whisk her into the centre of town in a matter of minutes. Mass mobility and livability, first realised in Golders Green in 1907. And the thing that then perfected this in 1933 was the creation of London Transport, effectively Transport for London's predecessor, which integrated electric buses, electric trains, electric tramways, trolley buses, all of them painted red, one sets of timetables, one fare structure, integrated transport hubs built around the city. And in the 1930s, London Transport carried 3.5 billion passengers every year. This was mass mobility and livability properly reconciled. And I kind of wish that was the end of the story. Done it. Finished. Over. Because in the 1930s, London was still the world's only megacity. But New York was catching up. And New York, under its chief planner, Robert Moses, was going down a very different path for attempting to answer the same question. And Robert Moses' highway-centric, car-centric vision for what a city could be was becoming popular. And by 1950, New York had overtaken London. By 2000, there would be around 30 megacities globally. Today, there's around 50. And most of them haven't followed the path set out by London in the 1930s. Most of them followed the path set out by Robert Moses in New York. And tragically, so did London. Because by the 1950s, London was suffering traffic congestion. That network of electric tramways, 3,000 electric trams, 1 billion passengers, by 1952, the entire network had been scrapped because the trams were getting caught behind the cars. London was reimagining what a city could be. The vision for the City of London, the ancient heart of London, was that the entire ground floor level would be reserved for cars, and the city would be rebuilt at the first floor level for people. And they started. Now this is a pedway. There's very few left, and not many, thank God, were built. But this is the vision that was created and intended for London in the 1950s. There was a plan for ringways, 4 orbital motorways to encircle the whole of London, connected by radial motorways, like a spider's web. And had they been built, huge numbers of places that many of you will have visited, Hackney, Brixton, Camden, Islington, all would have been demolished, gone. The house that I grew up in would have been demolished had these motorways been built. But again, it was that close. They started. Some were built, and the ones that were built, like that one, are still there, before Londoners protested and it stopped. The city that had learned how to reconcile mass mobility and livability had forgotten. And look what happened. London's population peaked in 1939, in the 1930s. As London became less livable, fewer people chose to live there. And the population fell, and it troughed in 1981, the year that I was born. But then something rather wonderful happened. London started to relearn some of the lessons that it had forgotten. And the place that's most visible is in the regeneration of the Docklands. This is a place called Canary Wharf. This was taken when I was a kid. The docks were derelict, empty, abandoned. Container shipping had made them redundant. Today, Canary Wharf is one of the largest and most successful business districts in the world. It looks very different. And to make that possible, the docks needed to be connected with the existing financial centre in the City of London, new connectivity. And you can see the change in London's vision of what a city should be in the attempts that were made to connect the City of London, the core of the ancient city, with Canary Wharf. So there's Canary Wharf. The first attempt, if you see at the top of the map there, the first attempt was this, which is the Limehouse Link, a 4-lane highway. 1980s thinking. London, a city of cars. But at the same time, a little experiment was done, and a light railway system was built as well. It was too small, didn't connect with the underground, and immediately became overwhelmed with demand. And it was realized that actually mass mobility meant public transport. So a proper, high-quality underground railway was built. And by 1999, it was built with these cathedral-like stations, absolutely wonderful structures. And very recently, the Elizabeth line has opened a new high-capacity mass transit railway, and that's Canary Wharf Station, which has this absolutely incredible roof garden on the top. And with the creation of Transport for London in 2000, a whole series of new innovations took place. Transport for London gained the power to raise a congestion charge. Contactless payment was introduced, making it easier and simpler and cheaper to use the public transport network. A cycle hire scheme was introduced. TfL had powers over river licensing for the first time. New riverboat services were introduced along the Thames, which had previously been unused for passengers for decades. New transport lines were created. An orbital railway called the Overground, which rather confusingly here runs underground, was created. And of course, the Elizabeth line. And in 2018, the Mayor of London set a wonderful, ambitious target through the Mayor's transport strategy that 80% of trips in London by 2041 would be made by public transport or active travel, sustainable modes. And I love the clarity and simplicity of that 80-20 vision, which is a challenge for a city a bit like Berlin, London. It's spread out, it's relatively low density. It's not like metropolitan Paris. Easy for Hidalgo, slightly harder in London. But that meant turning bits of London into something that looked a bit more like Paris. Let me take you to Springfield Park. So this is a park on a hill. I took this picture 2 weeks ago, and I was preparing for this presentation. I took my daughter up onto Springfield Hill, and you're looking back there over Walthamstow. And Walthamstow is the suburb in East London in which I live. And in that picture, you can see the Victoria line of the Underground mapped out below the streets. There's Walthamstow Central Station with its collection of tower blocks. There's the next stop, Black Horse Road Station, with its collection of tower blocks. There's Tottenham Hale Station, the next station, with its collection of tower blocks. None of those tower blocks existed 20 years ago when Transport for London was created. This is part of a reimagining of the city around public transport with high-density connectivity, linking high-density livability to enable the city to be focused on public transport and active travel. And as well as building new high-density housing around existing transport hubs, London is also building new transport hubs for high-density housing. 2 years ago, an extension of the Northern Line opened to Battersea Power Station. And Battersea Power Station is a, as the name suggests, disused power station, but look at the housing being built around the power station adjacent to this new station. This is Barking Riverside Station. And this is the new suburb that's being built on abandoned marshland around Barking Riverside Station. And as it happens, I flew directly over that today when I was flying here to Berlin, and about 1/5 of those houses are there. And you can literally see that street pattern, and it just stops, because only about 1 in 5 of those houses have been built. But it's being built right now. The London Olympics, the only reason Ken Livingstone, the Mayor of London, bid for the Olympics in 2012 was to create an excuse to regenerate a huge swathe of East London that had previously been derelict and to rebuild it for high-density housing with new transport connections. The Olympics was simply the excuse to get the government to take an interest in the funding to make it happen. It worked. But livability means more than how you move around. It means a city that's joyful to live in, and cars don't make the most joyful environment. This is the Strand in the very centre of London. This road leads to Trafalgar Square just a couple of years ago. And if anyone's ever visited Somerset House, which is one of London's main arts attractions, a rather beautiful 18th century building containing various art galleries, there it is, look, and it's absolutely lost amongst the traffic. If you go there today, there's Somerset House, and the area outside it has been absolutely transformed into a place for people, not a place for vehicles. And it's not just about tourist attractions. This is my local high street. This is literally 3 minutes walk from my house in Walthamstow. The left is what it used to be like. The right is what it's like today, a city being reimagined for people. Last week, the London cycleway network hit the milestone of, for the first time, being larger and longer than the London Underground network. None of that existed 10 years ago, none of it. And it's working. So in 2000, the year that Transport for London succeeded London Transport as the governing body for transport in London, more or less the same number of journeys were made by public transport and private transport. Today, public transport and active travel is well over 60% of journeys, on its way to that 80% goal set by the Mayor of London. So Transport for London has achieved a lot since 2000. But it's fundamentally learning and then improving upon the lessons that were learned by London back in the 1930s. That vision of a livable city connected by high-frequency electric transport, that's still the vision. But we've also learned that we can make it a bit more dense. That vision of an integrated transport network that was created by London Transport when everything was painted red in the 1930s is still the vision. But Transport for London now also includes responsibility for bikes and the main streets in London and taxis, just done better. And so a city that had learnt how livability could be achieved and then forgotten it is learning it again. And very recently, for the first time, surpassed its 1930s milestone and hit 9 million people, and is on track to increase further. Now, I don't want to pretend it's all solved. I mean, for a start, there are a whole series of new challenges that aren't simply the challenge of livability. We've got to address the challenge of climate change, which we didn't know about in the 1930s. And we've got to challenge the challenge of AI, which is going to upend our industry more than we can possibly begin to imagine at the moment. But in terms of the problem I've been asked to think about today, mass mobility and livability, I'm just going to say it's not all perfect in London and it's not all done. And I will tell you my personal measure for when it's complete, when we're done. And that is this picture here. This is the Houses of Parliament, the Palace of Westminster, which currently sits on Parliament Square, and it's a roundabout. And there are plans, slowly, painfully, nothing is ever easy. There are plans to replace that scene there with this vision here, reuniting the Palace of Westminster with Westminster Abbey, the medieval home of the monarchs of the United Kingdom through a beautifully pedestrianised Parliament Square. When that happens, when that is finished, then I will say that this particular mission is complete.